Our guest now is Jordan Gardner, an American who has been the chairman of the board and co-owner of FC Helsingor in Denmark since early 2019. This weekend, his club clinched promotion to the Danish top flight for next season. Jordan, congratulations, and thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, Grant, thanks for having me. Really appreciate it. It's been a kind of whirlwind 24 hours, lots of champagne, lots of excitement. Obviously bummed we couldn't be over in Denmark to celebrate in person with the craziness of COVID, but nonetheless, it's just been amazing. And so really appreciate you having me on.
Yeah, I mean, where are you right now, and how did you end up celebrating promotion where you were?
Yeah, I've been kind of hunkered down here in San Francisco where I live since February. Before then, I was heading to Europe, mostly Denmark, at least 1 week a month, sometimes 2 weeks a month, whether it was in Denmark managing the club or speaking at conferences or doing networking. So I've been hunkered down here, and it's been lots of getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning, watching the games, streaming on my computer. We had a Zoom watch party yesterday with our investor group here that are all Americans. And so it's doing the best we can with the situation. I think I told you before this, we've had 6 games in 19 days. So it's been a real whirlwind for us with so much at stake. And so it's obviously worked out in the end, and we're really excited.
So take me through this emotion itself toward the end of the game, because it was pretty hairy in terms of what the stakes were and how things played out.
Yeah, I mean, so basically we kind of came down the stretch with the last 4 or 5 games. We had a 6-point lead with 6 games remaining before COVID hit, and then they compressed the schedule. And what happened is the team in second place, a club called Aarhus Fremad, which is out in the western part of Denmark, they basically won every game down the stretch by an average of 4 to 5 goals. So they put a lot of pressure on us, and we struggled a little bit right after COVID with some injuries and guys not being fit. And we came down to the last match of the season where we had to go on the road and play a really big, strong, physical team, a good team, and get a result, either a win or a draw to advance. And the game was 0-0 up until the 91st minute, and they had a corner kick. The ball bounced around. Their guy smashed it off the post. Then our goalkeeper came up big with 2 huge saves. And so we're just kind of like, I don't even know what to say. The emotions were at that point because there's so much riding on it. Only one team out of 24 in our division gets promoted this year. And so, beyond the monetary, differences between the television revenue and all that kind of stuff, just it's 15 months of work coming down to 2 inches on the post. And so, that's, we could spend a whole podcast talking about promotion and relegation, and there's so much we've learned about that going through both a relegation and a promotion. But, when you're on the right side of it, there is absolutely nothing like that feeling. It's validation for everything you've done for almost over a year on and off the field. It's like you've made it, and it's really rewarding.
It would have been an out-of-body experience for me if I was in your position. I'm sure it was in a way for you guys. You would come on my podcast back in January 2019, right as you were about to buy the club. And you talked about the choice to buy a team in Europe as opposed to a more expensive MLS or even USL franchise. And you said you wanted to bring young, promising Americans to your club and give them a chance to develop in Europe. And I'm just sort of hoping in this conversation to have you tell your story of how things have gone since that podcast, since you took over there, and how what has happened has maybe fit, in some cases maybe not fit exactly with what you were thinking coming into it.
Yeah, I mean, so much has happened. I don't even know where to begin on so many different fronts. And look, I'm a pretty straightforward guy, so I'm not going to sugarcoat it. There's definitely things that we thought going in that turned out very differently. Specifically, the American player model, which is something that we still are very focused on. It turned out a little bit different. We had basically kind of a mini combine in Denmark last summer. We had a kind of a wide range of young Americans we brought over. Some kids were right out of MLS academies, 18, 19. We had some current Division I college players. We had some kids that were a little bit more experienced. Out of about 20 kids, we signed 3 of them. And we had them on the roster for about 4 months. And, it was a difficult adjustment for them. It wasn't necessarily cultural, but, the level of play in Europe is higher than I expected. I think higher than most Americans realize, even in the lower divisions in a place like Scandinavia. The technical ability of some of the players is just, it's much higher than on the average American player that we run into in this level. And so, some of those players, for whatever reason, it didn't work out. I mean, the good news is we were, one of those players that we brought over, he went back to MLS and he's at FC Cincinnati. 2 of the other guys are in USL. So, I mean, these are still quality players, and there's nothing wrong with that. So after that experience, we kind of figured, look, we need to maybe take a little bit of a different approach, maybe players that have a little bit more experience as being professionals to bring over. So we first said, look, let's bring over an experienced, maybe older professional that can kind of mentor the young Americans. And so we brought over a guy named Chris Cortez, who was the USL leading scorer. He scored, I think, 20-something goals 2 years ago in USL. He had been playing in Thailand, kind of a guy that had been on the fringes of MLS for a long time. And he turned out to be a really big signing for us. He came up with 2 huge goals for us in the spring season. And, we had this whole plan to kind of use him as a mentor to bring over the next batch of American players in the spring. And then COVID hit. And so obviously we can't bring Americans over now. It's not, the borders are closed. And so we're kind of in a holding pattern right now. I think the good news with the promotion is it kind of really opens doors for us in terms of the quality of the player that we can bring over. And then the other thing, we're having a lot of discussions about really good strategic partnerships. We've had some discussions with MLS clubs, with some USL clubs, with non-affiliated academies in terms of, really giving them a pathway to some of their players in Europe. And so I think that's something that it's just going to take time. An American player model in Europe, it's not like we're going to bring a player over and all of a sudden he's going to be Christian Pulisic in 6 months. I think some people have unrealistic expectations. So, we're really optimistic about that model, assuming COVID things get taken care of. On a similar note, we brought over a couple young players from other markets that have had a lot of success. We brought over 2 youth national team players from New Zealand, and I'm very well connected in that market. And those 2 players started all our games down the stretch. I think one or both of them within the next 12 to 18 months are going to move on to bigger clubs and get sold. So quality young players, and we've signed a handful of youth national team players from Denmark and Sweden. As COVID hit over the spring, we realized we really needed to focus more on the kind of domestic EU market for players because we didn't have any other choice. And so we've been really kind of pleased with the young talent pool we have. It hasn't entirely panned out quite yet with the American pool yet, but we still are very optimistic and we still have plenty of time to make that work. So from that perspective, it's been really, hit and miss and, mostly positive from our perspective. Beyond that, we could spend 3 hours talking about just the experiencing of owning a club in Europe, everything we've dealt with, just the social and cultural differences, going through a relegation basically right after we bought a club, and what the culture was like at the club. Because, it's so interesting is being an American, not having gone through a promotion or relegation. Everyone just talks about promotion, right? It's exciting. Everyone's so happy and there's euphoria. It's almost like the yin and the yang with relegation. It's so much negativity. And so we got to this club and we're like, oh my God, no one wants to be here. The players don't want to be here. The staff doesn't want to be here. The leadership, the ownership has been running the club in a really poor manner. You buy a failing business. And so for us, it was really important to spend the first 6 months. And I spent a lot of time on the ground bringing in, a new culture and new staff. So we brought in a new coach, about an 80% new players, new sporting director. Obviously, the way we manage it from the top was totally changing. And so for that, it took a lot of time, but it's really rewarding to see that culture change really paid off. Because without that, this club doesn't get promoted. The other team that we went down with when we got relegated last season, they finished mid-table in the second division this year. So I think without drastic changes and new, kind of American style leadership, this club does not even come close to getting promoted.
So at first you had hired Omid Namazi, who had been former U20 U.S. national team assistant and had worked in Iran, had worked in various places. And at a certain point, he was no longer the coach. Like, what happened there? And then was that sort of sudden for you? And then how did you adjust?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, look, I think Omid was a really, really good hire for us at the beginning. He gave us a lot of credibility in terms of recruitment when we first bought the club. And look, I think he did as best he could to try to keep the team up when we bought it. I mean, I don't remember exactly how many games. There was something like 6 games left. We knew there was a very high likelihood the club was going to get relegated. Look, it was on a personal level, it was tough for Omid. His wife is in Iran, and we were trying to get her a work permit or a visa to get into Denmark, and that didn't work out. Look, he's a really talented coach and he had lots of opportunities, and the opportunity with the Dynamo we knew was kind of in the background the whole time. And so we knew he probably was going to leave eventually. It was a little bit sudden for us, but at the end of the day, it's no different than when players move on. Like, look, we know who we are. We're not Barcelona. So when the opportunity came that he could move, and, he's very close with Tab, and what they're trying to build in Houston is really exciting. And so he moved on, and we were very happy for him, and we had about 2.5 months in the summer to find a new coach. And for us, that was a good opportunity to kind of reevaluate what kind of coach did we want, because we'd gotten a lot of negative feedback bringing in an American coach. Again, something else we could talk about for a while, and that not Omid personally, but it was just there's a lot of resistance to us as American owners, American coaches, even American players. And so we felt maybe it would be easier in the short term to bring in a domestic coach that had more experience with the Danish football market, especially with a club that had just gotten relegated, where there was a lot of pressure for us to get back promoted. We wanted someone who knew the ins and outs of Danish football, and no offense to Omid, but like obviously he wasn't that guy. And so we brought in a guy named Morten Eskesen. He was an assistant coach with Randers, which is one of the big clubs in the Superliga. And he's done a fantastic job. I really like him because he has a background not just in football, but he has a background in the real business world, in human resources, and he knows how to manage people. And I'm a firm believer when it comes to putting together these football clubs. It's like, yes, of course, talent wins, and spending the most money does win more often than not. But like, there's so much that goes into the motivation and the psychological component of it, and are the players comfortable, and how do you motivate men? I mean, we saw it again when we bought this club, where the players, they were very talented players, but they just weren't motivated psychologically. And so I think this game of football, everything's at the margins, like we talked about. The ball hits the post and the margins are that much. And so I wanted a coach who really could motivate the players, and he did a really outstanding job for us.
You talked about sort of American style management in terms of what you were hoping to bring to the club. And I'm wondering, what exactly is that?
Yeah, so the club we bought, it's basically was being run by an association, which is Denmark's version of a nonprofit, which you do see quite a few European football clubs being run. So no offense to him, but the CEO of the club and the chairman of the club was a police chief. I mean, that guy, we're talking about a club that was in the Danish Superliga the year before we bought it, with, millions of dollars in revenue. So, the professionalization of the club didn't exist. It was just really kind of being run hand to mouth, and they weren't maximizing any sorts of revenue. They weren't being sophisticated in any sort of way, whether it was player recruitment. They had a new stadium. One of the reasons that we were attracted to this club was there was a new stadium opening about 4 months after we bought it. They hadn't sold stadium naming rights. They hadn't pre-sold any VIP areas. Like, they hadn't done any of the back end work when it comes to commercializing the stadium. And so for us, look, I mean, it's not rocket science. You come in, you treat it like a professional business. The club, they were spending money like candy. And it was just like the money going out the door when we first bought the club was just incredible. And so, we had to sit down and really, tighten the ropes and professionalize the club and run it like a business. Because at the end of the day, like, I talk about this a lot, like, you don't get into football to become a billionaire. You shouldn't, because like there's better ways to spend your money, but like it has to be a business. And that's something we constantly battle with, even our own staff and the fans about, is like, look, like, if you guys want this club to be here in the next 20 years, we need to run it like a self-sufficient business. The club was basically, no one knew it, was on the verge of bankruptcy when we bought it. And so there's been a lot of my difficulties is coming in and being the bad guy and telling everyone, no, we can't do that. We had to have a really difficult discussion about our academy, and the academy was spending way too much money for a club of its size, too much staff. It just was ridiculous, the amount of money it was spending. And so we're like, look, this club just got relegated. Our revenues are dropping 75%. We have to make difficult decisions and changes. And so, I think at bigger clubs, the quote American model means certainly much more commercialization and sophistication when it comes to game day and stadiums and tickets and sponsorship. And that all applies to us. But for us, it's just simply like just running it as a professional business, really, which wasn't happening and doesn't happen at a shocking number of clubs.
And part of your strategy, right, is to develop players and sell them on. Is that still the case?
Absolutely. I mean, we had a lot of success already. I mean, even last summer, we sold one of our players. He wasn't a foreign player. He was a domestic Danish player. We sold a guy named Patrick Olsen. He's actually a guy who played for Inter when he was younger. We sold him for 500,000 Danish, which is a little bit under 100,000 US, to Aalborg in the Superliga. And, that's not an insignificant amount of money for us at the start. Obviously with COVID now, it throws the player transfer market definitely into flux. I mean, we were anticipating to probably sell at least one player this summer. Potentially one of our younger talented players. That's probably going to get pushed back at least 6 to 12 months. So that's still very much a model. It has to be a model for any club of our size. And I think, there's some good players coming out of our domestic academy. We continue to look to bring the Americans and the foreign young players in. So, clearly for us, our priority this past season was getting promoted. We had to play this balancing card between, we were still very committed to playing young players and selling them and getting promoted. And that tipping point was definitely more towards winning games. So going into the next season, I think we can definitely probably spend a little bit more of a focus on developing our young players to make them sellable once COVID passes.
And you mentioned there had been some resistance from fans of the team. How did that manifest itself? How have you dealt with it? Where are they now? I presume they're happy to get promoted.
Yeah, I think it's funny. One of the interviews, I don't know if it was your interview before I bought the club, they asked like, what do the local individuals think about the club? And I went back and read the articles, and I'm like, oh, everyone loves us. This is great. And like before we bought the club, that was the case. And I spent a lot of time on the ground. I have some ownership stakes in other European football clubs, small minority stakes, and I kind of tried to learn from some of those experiences about the ways they handled their supporter groups and how the local communities and how they engaged. Were they absentee owners? Were they not? And I tried to really do things differently. And in the end, it didn't really matter. I think, you know, I had to come in and make really difficult decisions for the club, and the locals, whether that's local or minority investors from the local groups or sponsors or fans, and they didn't like it. I mean, on one hand, we put a very strong squad together and spent a good amount of money for a club of our size. And so that I think people were pleased that we put a competitive product on the field. But we definitely have a very direct American brash way of doing business. Like, look, if this doesn't work, I'm going to change it, right? This the day we got relegated, I came out and said, like, look, things have to change. Things have to change at this club from a variety of angles. And a lot of the Danes locally didn't really understand it. They couldn't wrap their head around that. And so I think that cultural difference definitely rubs some people the wrong way. I brought over an American CEO, a guy named Jim Kirks, who's worked for me for a long time, and he's kind of done a better job maybe than I have in terms of learning the language and bridging the cultural gap a little bit and cultivating those relationships. But at the end of the day, we're foreigners in a foreign country, and particularly this market that we're in, even though it's close to Copenhagen, it's a very older demographic. It's more of a Midwestern community, and they're definitely very resistant to change. And so us coming in, and literally from the day we bought the club, we're changing everything about it because it wasn't working. It's been a pretty big adjustment period. So, long story short, look, everyone's happy about the promotion and all that, but I don't think there's a whole lot of love for our ownership group, unfortunately, and that's just the way it goes. Being a foreign group, they didn't like us bringing in a foreign coach, Omid. They didn't really like all the foreign players we brought in, and so I think that's the reality of being a foreign ownership group in Europe. You just have to navigate that as best you can.
And so, what other types of things have happened that were, pretty major since you bought the club that either you anticipated or maybe didn't anticipate?
I think there's a couple different things I would say. I mean, COVID, number 1, 2, and 3, I think that's obviously thrown everything into flux. I mean, being a small club of ours, luckily Denmark has not been hit particularly hard with COVID. I was just telling my wife that I think Denmark has about 12,000 cases total in the country. And obviously we're hearing Florida is getting 11 or 12,000 cases a day. So fortunately, the country has been spared. We haven't had any players or staff getting infected. They've enabled recently up to 500 fans at each game, which is great for our atmosphere. It doesn't really help us commercially because that's really just season ticket holders and sponsors and players, basically. So, I think it puts us somewhat optimistic in terms of the fall getting potentially back to full stadiums, potentially. But beyond COVID, there's been a couple things. The stadium that was built by the commune, definitely the city of Helsingor, was much more problematic than we expected. There were issues with the construction. The contractor went bankrupt. I mean, none of these are our personal issues. We don't own the stadium, but it created some challenges for us. We've had difficulties commercializing the stadium because of that. Beyond that, I think the number one thing that's been super interesting is just the cultural difference of Europe and Denmark between us in terms of the way they look at the world, in both from a business perspective and even a sport perspective. The socialist model, and we can spend an hour talking about politics. It's like everyone's equal, everyone's the same, no one's better than the other. So like when you have a player that is maybe very creative, a goal scorer that's flashy, that's brash, the Danes really try to kind of push that down and they discourage that kind of behavior, right? And so that's why you go to a game in Denmark and it looks like it's ping pong because it's 11 6'2" Danish dudes passing the ball in circles, and they're really good and technical, but you don't see that like amazing creative Cristiano Ronaldo type player or the Pulisic type athleticism because the culture doesn't encourage that. And so obviously we bring foreign players in and they, some of these Americans are incredibly athletic and they have skills and speed. And how do you integrate those two cultural differences? And where the Danes definitely have this kind of insular culture where, there's a Danish way of doing things. And if you don't do it that way, it's definitely a little bit discouraged. And so managing that cultural differences has definitely been a challenge on and off the field. I mean, off the field, look, I've never figured out a country that had so many holidays in my life. I mean, every week there's a Danish holiday and, the guys are leaving at 2:30. I mean, look, no one's going to cry for us about that, but it's, it's hard running a business when it's so focused on the quality of life is incredibly high in Denmark. I mean, people, their number 1, 2, 3, and 4 priority is family, and it's not work. And we're a football club, so it's a little bit different. We have people that are really passionate about the club. But at the same time, it's been a huge adjustment for us. And that's why I talk about this a lot publicly. Like, I can't imagine American Group going in and buying a 100 million euro club in France, right? Like, same kind of thing is like not understanding those cultural differences when it comes to the huge stakes. And not to say what we're doing is small stakes. It's relatively small in the scheme of Europe. It's like we've learned these things on the fly. It just so happens that the zeros at the end of our P&L are just less than other big clubs. So I cannot stress enough how enlightening an experience it's been, positive and negative, and that I can't believe that some groups, American in particular, go into Europe without having some form of that experience. Because otherwise, you might as well just light money and put it in a trash can, because you're going to be miserable and lose money, which is a lot of times what happens.
It does make me wonder. You're talking about the Danish soccer culture, how they produce the Laudrup brothers if they're not too into creativity.
I mean, I think, look, they're definitely outliers, right? I mean, you got Christian Eriksen. I mean, the Danish national team is really the quality of play in Denmark. This is not to disparage the quality of play and what they're doing. Mm-hmm. It was funny. I got a lot of shit from some of my Danish employees and staff a couple months ago when Denmark's U17s played the U.S. U17s in a friendly, and Denmark smoked us. It was like 5 or 6 to 1. And I mean, from my experience, that doesn't surprise me. I mean, we're making great strides in the U.S., and that's a separate podcast as well. But it's a culture that is so immersed in the sport, maybe not as much as the UK or some of Spain, but like it's so immersed in the sport, and they have a very, very technical way of looking at the game. And for the most part, I mean, I'm generalizing, right? They do produce some players. And certainly the interesting thing about Denmark is the top young players are moving abroad, where 10 years ago, all the top players in Denmark were playing for FC Copenhagen and Brøndby. Now they're playing for Inter and Ajax. And so I think that is changing the culture a little bit. But it's a really, really interesting footballing culture that's a little bit off the radar, right? It's not one of these huge European leagues that everyone thinks of, but on the same time, it's the biggest and best league in Scandinavia. It's on the European calendar, so it's very integrated in some of these other leagues. And everyone looks at Belgium and Holland, and obviously those countries do produce very, very good footballers. But like Denmark really holds its own, and that's why you see in the World Cup, they typically do quite well in the World Cup.
Yeah. So what has your day-to-day been like? Like, how much time have you devoted over the last year and a half to this club?
I've been on the ground in Denmark probably back and forth 20 to 25 times. I realized very quickly from some of my other experiences in European football that the absentee ownership thing doesn't work. A, the absentee ownership thing doesn't work. And B, for me, whether it's transitioning this club to bigger and better things down the road, or being that American owner, executive, chairman, CEO of a big club, like I needed that experience being on the ground. And I'm a hands-on guy. I'm an entrepreneurial guy. And this wasn't a project where it's like, okay, here's a check, someone else just run it for us. And I felt it was really, really important to have a lot of time on the ground. So, 1 to 2 weeks a month since March of 2019, pre-COVID, I was in Denmark. Over the last, I would say 6 months, it's transitioned to more of my time over there is spent just doing business development, whether it's speaking at conferences, networking with other clubs or other investors, doing other entrepreneurial things, but always spending at least one week a month in Denmark. And then I'm on the phone, conference calls every single day in Denmark, first thing when I wake up here with the time difference. So 1 to 2 hours a day on conference calls with our American CEO. So it's very labor intensive, obviously, but it's something that is really rewarding, because you can't replicate this kind of experience. You can't, we're dealing with the licensing process for our division up, and we're dealing with payroll issues, and we're dealing with, vacation issues, like all these little things that are not sexy and that aren't the work permit issues, right? And foreign player restrictions. And we can talk about them. You can talk about them on a piece of paper, but until you've actually lived through it, you just don't know. I mean, we talk about the next club, whenever that is, hopefully a bigger club, like, okay, if we're going to change the culture, we really have to do things quickly and be decisive. But like, let's say we buy that team in France. Well, it's really difficult, if not impossible, to fire employees in France. So like, maybe you should probably know that before you buy a club, or what is the footballing culture in that country. And so I think without being on the ground, that was the other thing that was kind of interesting, is having this kind of American centric view, I've spent a lot of time traveling for pleasure and for work. And you kind of just assume the culture in football is not that dissimilar in Belgium and Holland and Denmark and Sweden, but like it's so very different. Like we're right on the border across the channel from Helsingor in Sweden, which is a pretty big club in Sweden. My assumption was like everyone's dialed in. There's lots of, people are talking about Swedish football, and no, like not at all. Like no, like there's like a hard line there. Yeah, people go back and forth to buy beer and do all that kind of stuff, but the footballing culture in each of these countries is very insular. So if you're going to go into a country, you really, really need to know the ins and outs and have people and trust in that market before you do that. And I think that's a mistake that some Americans make.
So now that you are going to be in the top flight next season, how does that change things in terms of money incoming to the club? How does it change things for how you approach this off season before the season starts?
I mean, the main difference is there's a very big jump in television revenue. So there's a new television deal in Denmark for all the divisions. And that's one of the reasons there was only one team that got promoted from our division. They were restructuring all the different divisions. So we'll get more television revenue. Beyond that, everything's in flux with COVID. Helsingor as a city is in a very tourist-focused area. A lot of tourists from other parts of Denmark, from Sweden. And so, as you can imagine, with the borders being closed for quite some time now, it's been very difficult. A lot of our sponsors and corporate partners. So we don't know what that's going to look like, what that landscape's going to look like. Does our player budget projections have to kind of come down to kind of compensate for that? What exactly that's going to look like? But clearly from the valuation of our club and we get to be back on national television in Denmark, the television revenue, it's all huge jumps in the visibility of this club. And so it's kind of an open question at this point. The next division, the season doesn't start till September 1st. So we think between now and then, we'll hopefully have some more clarity as to what the financial model looks like a little bit. But at the end of the day, we're kind of at mercy of, is there another wave of COVID in Denmark? Do things continue to get better? Do the borders open up? Do the businesses continue to kind of recover? And so we just don't know yet.
And is there more to your goal for next season than stay up? Or is that the main thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think next season, the goal has always been to be a self-sufficient business. I mean, we've invested pretty heavily in the club in our current division where there was little to no television revenue. And so we want a self-sufficient model where we can not have to constantly dump money into the club and have a professionalized, well-run club that we can, really kind of chug along and sell some players and increase the valuation of our club and do things the right way. And so, yeah, I think for us, it's about being a stable club. That's really what we want to be, because this club has gotten promoted and relegated up and down the last 4 to 5 years constantly, and that's not viable for a club in the moving forward. So I think really what we're going for is stability at this point.
And what's sort of the medium to long term strategy? Like, are you wanting to sell this club for a higher price before too long? Is it something you want to keep long term? Are you looking at potentially buying other clubs in Europe?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, for us, it's always good, I think, to have some form of an entry-level club into Europe. That's what I like about this club. It has the right recipe to be an entry level for good young players, wherever they may be, hopefully American, to get into Europe. So I think the club serves a purpose. Of course, if the time is right and it makes sense for us financially, we will definitely look to exit from the club. This isn't a charity. At the end of the day, we're trying to do everything the right way. But at the end of the day, our investors would like a return. And so would I, of course, with the amount of time and energy we've put into it. So it's still kind of an open question. Obviously, it's only been 15 months. I think from a personal perspective, this project that I've been involved with has created a lot of visibility on what I'm doing, just in the fact that it's so unique. There's just very few Americans who are on the ground actually doing things. So there's been a lot of discussions with different groups, whether they're American or not, that are looking to do a lot of different things, whether they're looking to replicate the City Football Group model, whether they're looking to kind of have a fund portfolio of multiple clubs, whether it's an American group that's looking to buy a big club in the Premier League and looking for, people to partner with them who understand what the landscape is like in Europe. And so there's a lot of different discussions happening right now. Some have been kind of on hold with COVID. Some are accelerating because of COVID, because people see opportunities. So the good news with Helsingor is it's self-sufficient now. The first, I would say, 8 to 10 months, it took a lot of time and energy, but now it's kind of a well-oiled machine. I think it's in a good place, especially obviously getting promoted. And so it's looking towards the future. I don't know exactly what that'll look like, but I know there's a lot of demand for an interest in what's going on in Europe. And there's just frankly very few people who understand it. So we'll see.
I mean, right now it certainly seems like there's Americans who are buying clubs in Europe and they're buying them of different sizes, right? So like you have the Americans who own Liverpool, and then you've got the ones buying clubs in France, like Bordeaux, and then you're at a smaller number, but you're doing very much doing your thing over there. Like um, overall, when you look at the landscape, are there more Americans all the time interested in buying European soccer clubs, or sort of where are we in that trend?
I think COVID has accelerated that trend. You have a lot of, I would say, opportunistic Americans who are looking for deals. That's not to say they understand the landscape at all, because I think, look, I think there are groups, and Liverpool is one of them, the Fenway Group, that do a fantastic job. But there's, for every one of those, there's 8 to 10 American groups that come into Europe and have no idea what they're doing. I mean, example was the article in the New York Times the other day of Rocco Camiso buying into Fiorentina and not understanding or doing any due diligence whatsoever to understand there were like under the table contracts signed with agents and all sorts of crazy stuff going on. Like when I read he basically bought the club in 2 weeks and did no due diligence, like, I mean, of course that's going to happen. Now he has enough money where he can do whatever he wants, but I think this new wave of American investors is much more sophisticated and they're trying to treat it like a business. It's not just a vanity project. So I do think there's a couple groups. There's a group that I think just got into Dundee in Scotland and got them promoted. There's some kind of under the radar groups that are definitely being more sophisticated, but some of these other groups are coming in, and the Bordeaux group, American group, that did not end well for that group. So I think it's my hope, my goal at the end of the day is like, look, whether I'm involved in any of these projects or not, like I would just love to get on the phone with some of these guys before they pull the trigger and be like, look, like here's my experience over there. Just like take that with a grain of salt and know what you're getting yourself into, because if you want to make it a real business, it takes a lot of work and time and energy, and some of these groups don't care about that. But I do think that from a general trend perspective, we're seeing, look, the price point in MLS now is 300 plus million. USL is 10 to 15 million. Like you can go into the second division in Spain or France and get a team for 10 to 15 million and get 10 million in TV money. And if you're smart and savvy and do a good job, you can get it promoted and all of a sudden it's worth 75 million. And so for those more entrepreneurial, sophisticated investors who have more risk tolerance, like that's kind of where I fit in, it's super interesting and you can get in. Obviously, look, I totally get the American model. It makes sense. We went through a relegation and I totally understand why that's so stressful, right? Like we're budgeting towards next year. Are we going to spend enough that we don't have to worry about relegation? Like, of course, you always have to worry about relegation. And so I understand why the model is in place, but I do think there is a trend towards more sophistication and more interest in the European models that, at the end of the day, they offer more upside. Of course, they offer more downside too, but it's kind of this risk assessment.
So when you say you speak at conferences, what comes up? What do you talk about? Is it a lot of the stuff we've been talking about here?
Some, yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of interest in Europe about the American market, as I'm sure you're aware of. I think a lot of people are interested in MLS and the American models. I think they're very interested in like this American way of doing things and how American investors like myself can come in and really bring the commercial aspect of the game, like bring that level up in Europe, which is still a challenge. I mean, I tell people in Denmark, like, they're like, oh, like, how's your season ticket base and how's your spot? Like, I'm like, look, it's pretty straightforward in Denmark. If the weather's good and we're winning games, people come. If it's not, they don't come. And we have very little season ticket base because they don't buy tickets in advance, kind of similar to the Latino demographics in the United States. So, it's a battle in that respect, but I think they're just 15 years behind us when it comes to the business and the commercialization side of the sport, outside of maybe the top 4 or 5 clubs in Tottenham with a new stadium. Like you go to some of these clubs and it just would blow your mind, the lack of sophistication, the lack of scouting infrastructure, the lack of commercial infrastructure. So I think they're really keen to understand how they can grow those areas. They say that, whether they actually want to is another story, but though a lot of those conversations are about that. So yeah, that's what I would say.
I mean, do you have any interest in American soccer clubs, or do you want to focus mostly on Europe?
I would like to come back at some point and help and be a part of the growth of American soccer. I'm a firm believer in that. I mean, especially with the World Cup coming up, again, we could spend a separate podcast about all the challenges we have as soccer in this country with the federation and all that kind of stuff. And look, I know a lot of people in MLS, and I think there's a lot of clubs that do a good job, and there's some clubs in some markets that don't, and that's really frustrating to see. From an investment perspective, I personally, just my personal opinion, do not think it makes sense here and now. I think that the clubs that got into USL and MLS 5, 10, 15 years ago, great. where we're sitting today, they're going to need huge growth on the television media side. And I just don't see it. Certainly with COVID as well, I just don't see it yet. I understand a lot of American investors are in the long game for the next 25 or 30 years, and that's great for them. But, I'm dialed in enough in the global sense of sport where I can say, look, you can go to lower divisions in some of these bigger countries and get more TV money than MLS for a fraction of the cost. And so, I'm still very much a believer that, we're just at the very beginning stages of the growth of soccer in this country. And I do think sometimes it's difficult for people to separate out MLS from the growth of soccer in this country, which is the growth of the English Premier League and Bundesliga and American players going abroad and Liga MX, right? I'm a big proponent. I worked for a hot minute at Hugo TV with the guys from Relevant. And so I'm a big proponent of the growth of, the Mexican League in the US. And so I think there's just massive growth potential in the sport. The question is it just MLS? Is it just USL? Or are there other areas for growth? Can they capture some of that growth? And I think in some ways they do a good job. In other ways, there's some room to improve. So we'll see. It's probably not on the horizon today or tomorrow, but, I know a lot of the owners in MLS and I have a lot of respect for many of them.
So if I asked you in 5 years, where do you want to be? What do you want to be doing? What would you say?
I want to be an owner or a chairman, CEO of a top 5 club in Europe. I met, so there's an American chairman at Chelsea. I don't know if you know him, Bruce Buck. Yeah, I met Bruce, a really interesting guy, and that kind of got the light bulb. And I just hadn't known of an American. I mean, obviously there's American ownership, the Glazers on Manchester United, but I mean, I'm not a billionaire by any stretch. But when I met him, I was like, look, and he's obviously a little bit of an older guy, and I was like, look, like, no offense to him in Chelsea, but like some of these bigger clubs, they need an infusion of younger, new ideas. Absolutely, I think. They really could use people looking at the game in kind of this new way, new sophistication. And I think it's important. And that's one of my complaints with MLS sometimes is that it's a little bit of an old boys network. I've said this publicly too, in terms of management, ownership, executives. And so, for me, I think being at a big club in Europe, being able to kind of bring in this kind of American sensibility, bringing in like a younger perspective as well, bringing in a perspective of having run clubs even on a smaller scale, I think is something that's really interesting and unique. And there's so many things I see firsthand about the game, whether it's, player recruitment or dealing with agents or like the sketchiness, the same stuff you read. I just shake my head at that. And hopefully my hope is down the road, I can be a part of kind of a new way of looking at the game and trying to professionalize and modernize it. And, again, I come from a business background, so running things in an efficient way. And it just so happens to be a sport that I'm passionate about, but look at it in a different way than is currently being done.
Well, Jordan Gardner, congratulations on promotion with FC Helsingor in Denmark. Good luck next season. Thanks so much for coming back on the show.
Thanks, Grant. Really appreciate it.